$47,000. That's what your father earned last year. You know because you handled his taxes. You sat at the kitchen table with a shoebox of receipts and a W-2 with his name on it. You ran the numbers. And when the total appeared, you didn't react. You kept typing. He was in the other room, the television on. He had no idea you were crying. Not out of pity. Because in 8 months, you had already made more than that. You didn't mention it then. You haven't mentioned it since. This isn't a story about money. It's about the cost of being the one who changes everything. And the cost isn't what people assume. It isn't the effort. It isn't the trade-offs. It's the silence. A precise, deliberate, lasting silence that comes from crossing a line your family doesn't even know is there. You were born into the bottom half of households. That group holds a tiny fraction of total wealth, far less than people think. Your parents didn't know the percentage. Neither did you. You didn't need statistics. You had the grocery store. You understood the math before you ever learned algebra. You knew which items only looked affordable until the total climbed. You recognized the exact pause at checkout the moment your mother recalculated and decided what had to go back. You started making that choice for her. Quietly returning things before she had to. Telling her you didn't want them anymore. You were 8. You were already carrying someone else's discomfort. That's the inheritance you never chose. Not extreme poverty. Not cinematic struggle. Something quieter. The narrow space of almost enough, but never quite. A household where people worked, showed up, did their best, where nothing was handed to you, and nothing seemed within reach either. Both truths existing side by side, never discussed. The first rule: what you absorb about money before age 10 runs deeper than anything you'll be taught later. No one sat you down and said money was scarce. You learned it through repetition, through ordinary moments that didn't feel like lessons. They became background noise. They became air. The shift came at 17. Not dramatic. A teacher, returning a paper. She didn't give a speech. She just said, almost in passing, that you should consider applying somewhere bigger. That was all. But something changed, not your situation, just the boundaries of what felt possible. A scholarship followed. Partial. $6,200 a year for a school that cost $28,000. You filled the gap. Loans, work, whatever it took. By graduation, your balance was right in line with what most first-generation students carry. You had entered a life no one in your family had experienced. You moved into a dorm smaller than your childhood room. Your roommate owned a laptop worth more than your mother's car. You didn't say that out loud. You started learning not just the coursework, but a different language. The way some people spoke about money like it was a minor detail instead of the central structure of everything. You watched. You adjusted. You became fluent in something that wasn't originally yours. Then came the $847 tax refund. The first one you filed on your own. You sat in a library, used a free site, and waited. When the number appeared, you stared at it. $847. For some, it was nothing. For you, it was proof. A decision you made had created a positive result. For the first time, you felt like a participant in the system instead of someone it simply acted on. That feeling is small. It's also everything. The double life doesn't arrive with an announcement. It builds quietly. One day you're home for a holiday, and your cousin asks you to explain retirement accounts. Your uncle makes a joke about finance people. You smile. You say nothing. And somewhere in that moment, you realize you've become someone who stays quiet. Not because you're ashamed of where you came from, but because you don't know how to connect where you started to where you are now. And you're not convinced that connection works both ways. Data on economic mobility suggests that only a small fraction, around 7%, of children born into the lowest income group make it to the highest as adults. You're trying to become part of that fraction. You don't know the statistic yet. You just feel it. The in-between. Not fully belonging anywhere. At work, you adjust. You learn how to tell your story so it lands lightly. You figure out which versions are acceptable. The story about fixing a car with your dad using salvaged parts, that one works. The story about the electricity being shut off doesn't. So you keep one and drop the other. You become an editor of your own life. At first, it's deliberate. Over time, it becomes automatic. Eventually, you don't notice it at all. Meanwhile, your family calls. The conversations follow a pattern. There's surface-level news, and then there's the real reason. You've learned to wait for it. Sometimes it's rent. Sometimes it's a bill that showed up at the wrong moment. Sometimes it's just your mother wanting to hear your voice, because you're the one who left. And leaving, even when it's right, creates a space that doesn't quite close. You help when you can. You feel bad when you can't. You feel worse when you can. The second rule. The first person in a family to build financial stability doesn't just change their own situation. They shift what everyone else believes is possible. That sounds simple. It isn't. The guilt has a specific shape. It's not about doing something wrong. It's about distance. About watching people you care about remain inside a system you're slowly learning to step outside of, while they don't even know that another option exists. The first time you earn in a month what your father made in a year doesn't feel like victory. It feels disorienting. You expected it to feel like winning. Instead, it feels like standing in an empty room, open, but unfamiliar. You don't tell your parents what you earn. Not to hide it, but because you've already calculated the outcome. The information wouldn't help them. It might even hurt them. So you manage it quietly, the same way you once managed what went into the grocery cart. Protecting someone else's dignity, even if it costs you something. You don't try to explain investment accounts or retirement strategies. Not because you can't, but because you know how it would end. Confusion. Discomfort. Maybe even embarrassment. There's no version of that conversation where everyone walks away feeling whole. So you set things up on your own. You contribute regularly. You let time do its work. And you say nothing. Median income for working-class households without a college degree sits in a range you passed years ago. First annually. Then monthly. You've told no one. You're keeping score alone. The weight of that isn't dramatic. That's what surprises you. It's not loud. It's steady. A constant pressure, like weather. Like something you breathe without thinking. The shift becomes undeniable not when you buy something, but when you look at your numbers. Your actual position. Savings, investments, minus debt. You see $47,000. Then $53,000. Then, gradually, $71,000. There's a threshold people talk about, not officially, but often observed. Somewhere between $25,000 and $50,000 in net worth. The point where losing your job wouldn't immediately break everything. Not comfort. Just margin. That distinction matters. Margin isn't freedom. It's time. A few months where things don't fall apart. 4 months, maybe. 4 months is more than your parents ever had. 4 months is a fundamental shift from where you began. You don't celebrate. You check the number again. Refresh. Confirm. What you feel isn't exactly happiness. But it's close to relief. A specific kind of relief, the kind that comes when someone has been bracing for impact for so long they forgot they were bracing at all. The third rule: the first generation doesn't really build wealth. They build the base that wealth stands on. They don't see the finished structure. They lay the groundwork. They pass something forward to people who don't exist yet. There comes a moment when the math shifts. When you're no longer just putting money aside, you're watching it grow. When the distance between what you earn and what your assets generate starts to narrow. When you sit down one evening, look at the projections, and realize that if nothing changes, your children will begin where you are now, not where you started, but where you are now. That realization takes a second to settle. Your children, real or imagined, won't understand the quiet calculations of a grocery trip. They won't recognize that pause at the register. They won't know what it feels like to put something back. They won't experience the embarrassment of a declined card. They won't sit at a kitchen table doing their father's taxes and quietly holding back tears while the television hums in the next room. They won't know any of it. Because you carried it. That's the exchange. That's what all of this was really for. Not the accounts. Not the income. Not the number on a screen. The exchange was always this: you take on the weight so the next person can start further ahead. You're not just building wealth. You're resetting what normal looks like. You're changing the baseline. You're rewriting the answer to what's possible. You are the last generation in your family to experience it this way. Not because of luck. Not because you outworked your parents. They worked harder than you can fully measure. But because you had access to information they didn't. And you used it. You stayed consistent. You kept going when it became quiet, and isolating, and unfamiliar. $47,000. That's what your father made last year. You're at the same kitchen table again. The same box of receipts. The same forms. His name on a page that represents a full year of effort. But this time, the numbers look different. You don't see shortcomings. You see someone who showed up every day, so you could sit here now with the perspective you have. You see the base that everything stands on. You see the person who made it possible. You still don't say anything. You keep working through the forms. He's in the other room. He has no idea what he set in motion. He built you. And you're building something he won't fully witness. Not because he isn't paying attention, but because what you're building lies ahead, not here. It exists in children who won't have to learn those early lessons. In a future where your family name carries a different expectation. In a question your parents never had the space to ask. What happens when someone decides the pattern stops here? You're the answer.